Good morning. My name is Jane Ranum, and I am chair of the St. David's um, Partnership and Child Welfare team here at Westminster. We are pleased to join the Social Justice Ministry team to present this morning's forum. The Social Justice Forum's theme for this program year is investing in each other's future. Through these forums, we aim to learn about opportunities for engagement and action by Westminster members to help ensure that all our neighbors thrive, to better understand the structures and systems that have failed many of our neighbors, and to explore ways that we can work together to build better outcomes. Today, we are pleased to welcome Amber Buck, Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion for Washburn Center for Children here in Minneapolis. And it is a nonprofit that has served Minneapolis and surrounding communities for very many years. Washburn team has witnessed the intensifying crisis in children's mental health. Children are showing up with more complex mental health needs and increasing evidence of trauma. This morning, Amber will share what they are seeing at Washburn and help us to better understand the impact on our community and specifically the barriers around equity and diversity. Before we get started, just a couple items. For those attending in person in this MISL room, please raise your hand and I'll bring a microphone to you so all, including those in the live stream, can hear your questions or comments. And then for those attending via live stream, please submit your comment or question in the live stream chat and we'll monitor that to make sure that your question or comment is recognized. And with that, we warmly welcome Amber Buck.
Good morning, folks. Happy Sunday. I am very happy to be here with y'all, and I'm happy that you are here with me. So my presentation style is really fast. I don't know why. I'm from Minneapolis, not New York. So if I'm talking too fast, please let me know, and I will slow down. It's also fairly interactive, so I hope you like who you're sitting next to or near, because you will talk to them. My apologies if you don't. You can sneak a little bit and go to another chair, so you have a better companion for the duration of this presentation. So this presentation is about talking to kids about social justice. The first half of the presentation is why it's important that we do that, and the second half is ways that we can start doing that. But before I get started, I always start with a question. I am really embedded in restorative practices, and part of restorative practices is getting to know each other. So find someone next to you, and I would like you to answer this question. If you were to say you were in your happy place, where are you and what are you doing? The only real correct answer is eating steak and Brussels sprouts, but I'll take whatever you give in terms of your answer. So just take a minute, 60 seconds. If you're in your happy place, where are you and what are you doing? All right, folks. I tried to creep a little bit on your conversations, but all I heard was sitting down a lot and going to sleep. Is there something that I missed? Shout out one of those. Huh? We were awake. Okay. So your happy place is not going to sleep, because that's my happy place too. Awesome. I hope you got to know someone even a little bit better. And now I'll tell you a little bit about me. My name is Amber Buck. I'm the Director of Equity and Inclusion at Washburn Center for Children. A lot of the work that I do is with therapists, actually, not the clients. So our therapists are really dope individuals. They're fun and they're exciting and they're knowledgeable and they're full of empathy. And the population of children that we're working with is very diverse. 50% of the kids that we work with are BIPOC. More and more kids are questioning their gender and sexuality, and our therapists have a wide breadth of knowledge around the theories and maybe not so much around the cultural competence. So my job is to up that cultural competence. And I am fairly new to Washburn. I've been at Washburn 2 years. Prior to that, I wanted to be a school counselor. So I went to school to be a counselor for a while. But the thing that like protects your heart from the kids, that you don't want to take them home with you, I didn't have that. And so I went to work with college students. And I did a lot of mental health, case management, and crisis response with college students. I also worked at University of Oregon, North Dakota State University, University of Vermont. And I also did equity and inclusion work. And so I'm excited to be at Washburn and do a bit more equity and inclusion work. One of the things that we do at Washburn is we call it grounding in. So we come into these spaces and we have like a million things in our mind. What are we gonna eat? Where's the bathroom? Is there water? How's the coffee? Is it good? Who made it, right? Like all of these things are in our head, and it's nice to just take a second to breathe. So instead of like the 3 or 4 minute ground in that I usually do, I'm gonna do a quick one. So I'm just gonna ask you to release your jaw. Roll it around a little bit. Lower your shoulders. Roll them around a little bit. Wiggle your toes. Mostly kids do this. I feel like most people haven't wiggled their toes just to wiggle them in years. Roll your neck. And take the next hour just to be here. To be present in the moment, to be here because you chose to be here. So forget about your phones, forget about your worries, whatever you got going, and just be here. And the last thing I want you to do is take a breath in, hold it for 4 seconds, and let it out. Here we go. So unfortunately for y'all, I love theory. So you're gonna get a lot of theory from me today, but there are two specific ones. This is my absolute favorite theory. It's called emotional intelligence. And so it's 3 parts to emotional intelligence. And the first one is consciousness of self, knowing yourself, right? So as therapists at Washburn, like this is what we try to do for everyone, helping them understand themselves, their tendencies, all of that. Think about if you've ever been to like a wedding or reception and you're like dancing, right? Like you got this. Like you're like, I am feeling the music is me and I am it, right? And then you see a video of yourself dancing and you're like, oh, maybe me and the music were not the same, right? Maybe we weren't in sync in the ways that I thought, right? Understanding yourself, what you're showing up into the room with, is the first part of emotional intelligence. Oops. The second part is consciousness of others. So understanding that other people have a very different experience than you have. For example, I have a friend and we often work out, right? And so he was coming to my house to work out in the gym in my apartment. The parking lot is on in the basement and the gym is on the 2nd floor. And he's getting ready to walk up the stairs. And I'm like, I'm not walking up the stairs. And he's like, why not? We're going to the gym. Why wouldn't you want to walk up the stairs? And I was like, there's no windows in the stairwell. And he had never thought of that, right? I was like, I don't feel safe in the stairwell by myself when there's no windows, there's no way out. And that had never occurred to him as a thing. Because most women are socialized to always protect yourself, always be aware of your surroundings, always be in a place where you can defensively protect yourself. Put your like key in between your fingers, right? Like that was not the socialization that he had been brought up with. Or when I went to school in North Dakota, I was a theater kid. Who would have thought, right? So I was a theater kid, and my professor was this white woman who had gone to a country in Africa and had this truly transformational experience. And I was like, cool, tell me about it. And she's like, we are going to visualize my experience. I'm like, yes, theater, dope. Like, let's do this visualization thing. I got it. So we're closing our eyes, and she's like, close your eyes and imagine that everybody around you looks different from you. And I'm like, it's North Dakota, Fargo, North Dakota. Like, I don't have to close my eyes for this. Like, I get it. And then she keeps going, like, and everyone comes from a very different place than you. And I'm like, yeah, still, right? Like her consciousness of others, me particularly, was off, right? She had had this truly transformational experience of really being the only one and didn't realize that in so many instances that my college education at North Dakota State University was just that, being the only one in the room. And then she was like, oh, I get it now, right? So understanding that people have a very different experience than you based on the identities that they hold. And the last one is consciousness of context. And I have a really good story for this one. So I told y'all I used to work in higher education colleges, right? And my job was to respond to crisis, right? And I'm like at the top of the chain. So by the time it comes to me, it's awful. Like everything is awful, right? And this is the context that I was working with for over a decade. So one day I am making dinner for my son. And my son at this time, I think, is like four or five, right? And I'm making dinner, and I see him, and he's in a corner. And he is like balled into himself, and he is breathing like, and like the context of everything that I've seen in the worst of people moments, like jumped back at me. So I'm like slamming the dinner down. I'm running to my kid, right? I'm getting his hands, and I'm like, baby boy, tell mommy what's wrong. Tell mommy what happened. And he says, I'm smelling my boogers, mommy. Right? My heart is beating fast. I am traumatized. I think the worst thing is happening to my kid, and he is over in the corner being a 4-year-old. But the context that I was bringing in the room, the things that I was noticing, the things that like made sense to me were tragedy, crisis. I need to call the police. I need to work with the police chief and the fire. Like all of the things that I thought I needed to do were not. He was being a 4-year-old, and I was bringing my context of crisis into the room. So as I talk through some of the things today, I want you to think of what context you're bringing into the room. What about your life experiences, like trigger things in your brain for you that this is what this is? And what are we missing? What parts are we missing because our context hasn't included them yet? The other theory that I will be talking about is called Dunning-Kruger. And this is one of my favorites. It is from 1999, and it's a bias that people with the lowest amount of expertise or experience regarding a certain task or a certain skill think that they're the best. Think that they overinflate their ability. And part of this is they don't really know the qualitative difference between a beginner, a middle, and an expert. For example, 88% of drivers think they're above average drivers. 88%? 88, did y'all drive this morning? Would you agree that 88% of drivers are above average drivers? Probably not, right? Or a lot of people think that they can score a point on Serena Williams. Like the top athlete. They think that they can score 1 point. I can get 1 point on her. At one point, she did it with like 7 men. And none of them got a point. In fact, they were running away from the balls that she hit, right? So this idea that you think that you're better at something than you actually are. And for me, this is the hardest thing with equity and inclusion. Everyone thinks they're better than they actually are. And that's because the spectrum is so wide. You can always look at somebody else like, I'm not them. I must be advanced, right? And so I think of equity and inclusion and trying to go away from like oppression and bias and all of these things is like the walkways on the, in the airport, right? The ones that you walk on and they take you where you're supposed to go, right? So if you are doing absolutely nothing, right? The way that the United States specifically was set up, you are still moving towards oppression. You are still moving toward bias and implicit bias and all of those things, right? And so when people think they know a little bit more, they just notice they're moving. They look down and they're like, oh crap, I'm moving forward. But they don't do anything, right? Or they turn around and they're like, I'm gonna walk, right? I'm gonna walk the other direction. And that's still not enough because maybe you're negating the effect of the walk forward, but you have to run the other direction, which means that being anti-racist, being not homophobic, being accepting of all identities means you have to do something. You can't just be nice and kind and sweet, because nice and kind and sweet still has implicit bias. And we're going to talk about some of the ways that implicit bias shows up. So implicit bias is the ways that bias shows up in our brains. It's unconscious. We don't even think about it, right? So the top part of our brain, the frontal lobe, this is like the smart part of our brain, right? This is the part of our brain that is done developing at 25, right? It is the newest part of our brain. This is where executive functioning, thinking, rational thinking lives, right? Back here is where all of our impulses live, right? In our limbic system. All of the things that we automatically do are in our limbic system. And if you are a little bit stressed, that frontal lobe is going to run and hide. And the limbic system is going to take over. And that's where implicit bias is. So like, for example, I had a friend, and he does equity and inclusion work as well. His wife was in the hospital, right? And he was waiting for the doctor to come out. And every time he looked up and the person who was walking through the door was not a man, he looked back down. That's not the doctor, right? He's stressed. His wife is in the hospital. His brain is not working enough to realize that women can be doctors too. And he does this work every day, right? And so implicit biases show up, and I'm going to show a couple examples of the ways that it show up that I think are pretty interesting. So band. So if you think of symphonies and orchestras, right, they don't often have openings. And when people get into a symphony or a band, they stay pretty much for life, right? It's a good job, especially for someone who wants to play instruments for the rest of their life. And so when they often do have auditions, a lot of times women weren't getting through. So what they decided to do were blind auditions for symphonies, which makes sense, right? You hear somebody play the violin or the piano or the cello. You don't actually have to see them to hear the music and understand their skill level. When they started doing blind auditions for bands and symphonies and orchestras, women increased almost 3 times as much as they were before, right? So seeing a woman play an instrument, implicit bias was engaging because they were playing it at a superb level and people weren't seeing it, right? That's a way that implicit bias shows up. Another one is with accents. So people who have accents are seen as less trustworthy and less credible just because they have an accent. And they did this study where they had people talking without an accent, with a deeper accent, and then they questioned how credible or trustworthy they found the people who were talking and the information that they were giving. So they found that people with accents, people who have especially really thick accents, people think they're untrustworthy, not smart, and not credible, just because they have an accent, right? Another form of implicit bias showing up in literally somebody talking. You don't know anybody's level of expertise or credibility by hearing them talk, but a lot of people perceive that they do. Another one is with race and law. So they sent out a memo to law firms and said, hey, can you look at this memo? And they purposely put errors in this memo, right? And the name on the top of the memo was the same. They were both Thomas Meyer. And they said Thomas Meyer was black for half of them, and they said Thomas Meyer was white for the other half. When they thought that Thomas Meyer was black, they found more errors. They rated him as less successful. And the comments that they put on his resume and things like that were, how did he pass law school? How did he pass the bar? How is he a lawyer? He needs so much work. I can't believe he's in this field, right? The Thomas Meyer, they're the exact same, right? The Thomas Meyer that they thought was white was great potential, right? Needs a mentor and can really excel in this field. And they found less errors in his memo, right? Implicit bias showing up in how, if we know the race of somebody, we are looking for different things or attribute certain things to them based on their perceived race. This one is quite famous. I think a lot of folks have heard of it, but they sent out resumes with black-sounding names like DeAndre Smith and white-sounding names like Tom Smith, right? And they sent out these resumes and counted how many callbacks they got from the resumes. And of course, the resumes with Tom Smith got way more callbacks than the DeAndre Smith. Interesting enough, they also did this with churches, right? They left voice messages with black-sounding names and white-sounding names and said, hey, I'm interested in joining your church. Like, can you give me more information? And the white-sounding names and the white-sounding voices got more callbacks from the church to join than the black-sounding names, right? So this is across field, this is across people, it's implicit bias, it affects everyone. So because I am a business person, I got my MBA when I was at the University of Oregon, I'm always about the business case for diversity, right? I'm always about the key performance indicators, the return on investment, like the ways in which you can invest in diversity that really make your organization better, right? And so I love that. If you Google like McKinsey or anybody that does all these consulting firms, they'll give you all of these stats around like diverse groups bring in more money, diverse groups have more retention of people, diverse groups take longer to come to a conclusion or to build a product, but the product lasts longer and makes more money, right? So all of these studies about the business case of diversity, but the part that I like about the business case of diversity is thinking about when people get it wrong. And they might have gotten it right if they had more diverse people at the table. I know y'all might be looking at this picture like, what is Amber got going? But I promise you it's worth it, right? So This is a CPR dummy. And they found through research that women are less likely to get CPR by a stranger, even if that stranger is trained in CPR. And the reason is women have breasts, right? And they don't know where to place the hands. They don't know how to work around breasts because the CPR dummy has a flat chest. So when you're getting trained in CPR, you don't know how to do it with someone with breasts, right? And breasts aren't exclusive to women, right? People don't know how to do CPR with people with breasts. And so they've had this little contraption built because women were not only not getting CPR, they weren't getting it correctly because of the ways that we practice CPR, right? The second one is around crash test dummies. So crash test dummies are not women. Crash test dummies are actually on the median male, which is around 5'7", about 175 pounds, right? So they, of course, have the best outcomes if they were to get in a car crash. Men get in more car crashes than women. Women get hurt more and are more likely to be injured, both moderate and serious injuries, and are more likely to die in a car crash because we don't even test on women's body parts. We don't even test on tall men. Right? We don't test on fat men, fat women, pregnant women. And when they did finally include women in crash test dummy tests, they put them in the passenger side, right? Even though we know that women sit closer to the wheel because we are usually shorter, and they say that is incorrect alignment for the perfect place to sit in a car because, again, it's made on the 5'7", 175 male. Another way that not having diverse people at the table is office temperature. If you've ever been cold in an office, raise your hand. Right? We got a lot of people. So if you are not, again, 5'7", 175 pounds, you are likely to be cold in an office building because office temperature, the ideal temperature that most like big offices and big places are set at, are for the metabolic rate of a 5'7", 175 male. If you are 5'7", 175 male, you got it going in this life, right? You got it going because most of the tests around these things are built for you and your optimal safety. Another thing is speech recognition software. Responds to men's voices more than it does to women's voices. So if you ever tried to get Siri or Alexa or any sort of voice-activated thing to work for you, it works better for men than it does for women. They also found that people are meaner when the voice on the artificial intelligence is a woman than it is a man, right? What? Like that blows my mind, right? It's not even a real thing. But when the voice of Siri or Alexa or all of these people are women-identified voices, they're meaner to the voice than if it is a male voice. And the last one that I'll talk about is medicine and diagnoses. So a lot of the medicine that we do and that we are pushing for is based on rats, right? We do testing on rats. But more specifically, we do testing on male rats. Because female rats have too many hormones and they might mess up the test. So a lot of the breakthroughs in science, a lot of the medicine that we put forth hasn't been tested on a woman because the hormones jack things up. Even though they found that males go through a similar hormonal cycle as women, of course not with like a menstrual cycle or anything like that, but their hormones of men cycle similar to women, and we still haven't gotten a lot of the medicines to, a lot of the tests to include female mice. And then we also see this in the medical industry with diagnoses. So if you think of autism, when autism first came on the scene and we started to understand what autism is and like how it impacts people, we thought it only impacted men. So the foundational research of autism and what it is and how we interact with it are based on men. So they would get all men studies and study autism in men. It wasn't until fairly recently that we realized that men and women are different and the socialization of men and women are different. And so autism shows up in very different ways in women than it shows up in men. Right? And so a lot of folks are like, why do we have so many autism and ADHD diagnoses in the last 10, 15, 20 years? Like, I don't understand. This is new. Prior to that, we just didn't know. And also we institutionalized a lot of people. So they weren't in our mainstream population. We're almost like, this might be the first generation of people who have autism and other developmental delays that are actually integrated into the population. This is also the first generation of, maybe the second, depending on when you check, the first generation of women that are allowed to exist in the world and be able to move forward without their connection to a man. People who can get their own apartments, which you couldn't do before. People who can't get fired because they're pregnant, which you could do until like the 70s or something like that. Women who can vote. And we think of women as this one monolith, but white women, Latinx women, Black women all had different dates in which they were actually allowed to vote in this country. And so this is the first generation of women who are allowed to live autonomously without a man. And we're seeing some of the consequences of that with our younger generations. I say all of this to say, and at the University of Vermont, we talked about the Book of Rules. And I like to think of the Book of Rules as these two paths, or like the neural pathways in your brain, right? Implicit bias is the easy path. That's why we have them. That's why we have implicit bias. We don't have to think too deeply about things. We can have these pathways that are made for us through media, through people, through like what we hear on the news. We don't have to think very much to undo the implicit bias because it's everywhere, right? And you can find like proof positive that it's true in a lot of different instances, so you don't have to think too far. So the neural pathways for implicit bias is really smooth. What I'm asking folks to do is to go on this rocky road and to really think about the implicit bias that shows up in your life, especially when we're talking about children, especially when we're talking about social justice in children, talking to kids about social justice. So we'll talk a little bit about that now. I have a quick video. Hopefully it plays. This is from, it's actually not a social justice video, but I enjoy it to talk about social justice, but it does talk about parenting.
Parents. Throughout history, we've struggled to get it right. We hope we won't pass on our emotional issues to our kids, and we swear we won't make the same mistakes our parents did. We all have great intentions, but something seems to get in the way. Let's look at what that might be. At Circle of Security Parenting, we believe that being emotionally available to our children and their needs is the key to doing our best as parents. We call emotional availability being with. It means teaching emotional intelligence by being with our children in all their feelings, like sadness, joy, anger, curiosity, pain, frustration, excitement, and so on. Being with children helps them understand, trust, and move on from feelings. And knowing someone is with them in their feelings helps children feel less overwhelmed and more secure. Decades of research backs this up. For parents, some of this comes easily, but other times our children express emotions that make us uncomfortable, so we pull away or try to overrule their feelings, which leaves them on their own. We do this because our children's feelings can trigger strong emotions in us. We think of it like this: our history during childhood of how core people responded to our different emotions creates the background music for how we experience our children's feelings. Let's look at this example. This girl and her father have been enjoying time together in the park, but suddenly aware of the time, Dad says, "We need to go." When the girl hears this, she starts crying and gets increasingly angry. All at once, the dad's background music changes. The background music that is playing for the father right now, we call shark music. As it turns out, the dad's own mother was uncomfortable with loud displays of emotion, and she didn't know how to handle them. So throughout his childhood, she repeatedly told her son it was pathetic to cry, and she never ever asked him about his feelings of sadness or anger. His ability to deal with his daughter's emotion now is greatly affected by the experience with his mother then. Shark music. We're rarely aware it's playing, but it's our past experiences telling us to be afraid of or uncomfortable with a feeling or need that is actually safe. When our shark music limits our ability to respond to these feelings, our children learn to hide or feel ashamed of them. This is a problem because we're teaching our children to fear emotions that are actually both safe and essential in life. Most of us experience shark music with one emotion or another, and it's different for everyone. But whenever it is triggered, our ability to respond to our children's needs is limited. The good news is, by simply calling it by name and reflecting on what our children need in the moment, we can turn down our shark music. This is so important because if we can learn to manage our history of negative experiences and perceptions, we can respond to the truth of our child's current situation and be with them in it. Ultimately, this will help our children grow up with a better ability to understand and share more of the emotions they experience. There's no escaping it. Strong feelings are a challenge to manage as parents, but our children always benefit when we have an accurate response to what's happening, rather than reacting to the shark music we're bringing into the relationship. Remember, there's no such thing as perfect parenting, and blame never helped anyone feel more secure. That includes blaming ourselves. But the more often we can identify our shark music, the better off our children will be.
So I'm curious, what are some topics that bring up your shark music? Because everyone has it, even if you're a parent or whatever, it comes up. For me, it was always felt the need to, like, when my kids are acting up, to like loudly berate them in public so that people know, like, on top of it, right? And I realized fairly early in my parenting that that was like a leftover thing from slavery, right? And after Jim Crow, right? So when you were a Black parent with a Black child who was messing up and the owner was white and all of the people were white, like, you wanted to be the one to enact punishment on your child instead of anyone else. So loudly overdoing it was a way to protect your child in a way, right? And that got passed down even though the context of parenting had changed, right? And so me wanting to be like, stop that, put that down, was like me saying, I got this. Nobody else step in. Nobody else hurt my child. I will do it so that you don't have to, right? A remnant of slavery that got passed down that's no longer needed, right? When people say, oh, your kid is great, I'd be like, you can have them. You can have them, right? Another remnant of slavery, right? Or like talking down on them, like, they're so great. They're not that great. I promise you, they're not great at all. Wanting to protect specifically your daughters, right? Of someone like, hey, she's looking good. Like, actually, she's terrible. Actually, she's really, really bad. How about you don't look at my daughter that way, right? And so all of these remnants of a historical trauma that existed in this country are informing my parenting now. And I had to unlearn that. I had to learn how to breathe with my kids, how to tell them the appropriate thing to do or not to do, and not to think in a way that was out of context for me, right? And so my shark music is, people are going to think I'm a bad parent, and I have to do something to counteract that. I have to do something to let them know that I am an active parent that cares about my kids, right? So I'm curious what your shark music is, either with your kids or with social justice, right? What's the thing that your kid can say that you're like, ooh, let's not talk about that, right? Let's change the subject quick, fast, in a hurry. So I'm curious. Talk to your neighbor, someone next to you. What is your shark music? What is the thing that's a normal developmental thing for a kid or for a friend or for a family member that, like, brings the shark music in your head? I'll give you about 2 minutes to talk about that. All right, folks. Would, would anyone like to share out loud some of the things that they came up with or some of the things they thought about?
mean, one of the things with, like the George Floyd thing that happened, one of the things that bothered me the most with that is that I didn't feel worse. I'm going, yes, it was a terrible tragedy. Nobody can deny that. But I mean, in my mind, I'm going, is it the worst thing that ever happened? Probably not. But yet, that's how the world kind of felt. And why didn't I feel that way? And so, like I say, it's like, why didn't I feel worse? And I was saying to the group here that one of our goals at where I work is to hire more minority workers, whether it be colored people or women or whatever. And I can come up with instances where in the past 3 years we've hired people to check the box and they're no longer there because they couldn't do the job. So were they hired because of skills? Were they hired because they fit the box? Were they? I don't know. I can't answer that question. I wasn't on a hiring committee. I wasn't on a firing committee. But so these are things that just come to my mind, and it's like, so like I say, this stuff just pushes me. It really does.
Okay. Another thing is when you're talking, that's better? Thanks.
Turn it down.
Turn it down?
It's too loud.
What if I just put it further away? Is that better?
That's better.
Okay. Another thing you said, colored, the language that most people use now is BIPOC or people of color. And so when you're bringing people in, it's hard as a person of color to know that you're bringing someone in as if to check the box, right? That's a situation that no one really wants. And if other people think that you're coming in to check the box, your experience there is very different, right? They treat you as if you don't have the skill set. They treat you as if you're not as good. Back to the implicit bias example where they found more mistakes in the person of color than they did the white person, that shows up on the job as well. And I would imagine that people of color and Black people who are brought in to add diversity are gone because of experiences like that. And I applaud you for coming to places that activate your shark music, right? That's the only way that we are going to stop on that, that railroad, not the railroad. What is it?
It's a path.
The thing, the
Path.
airport, sheesh, the walking walkway, my own dang example. That's the only way that we're gonna stop, pause, and be able to go in the opposite direction so that people who do come to your organization that are minoritized, that are BIPOC, that have minoritized identities feel like they belong there and not that they're checking a box. And so I thank you for your comment. I think the reason that race and culture are often combined is race and ethnicity for Black people are the same thing, right? So we took away we're from Kenya, you're from Uganda, you're from Ghana, because we don't have records of where we pulled slaves from. And so often race and culture are colluded in a certain extent because of the history of oppression in this country. And culture is different from race. And in a lot of ways, for people of color, they have become one and the same. And I think you had a comment here.
I'm legally blind, so I can't see it.
Okay.
Okay. But anyway, all right. So I've got a trigger point going on right now, and I think, okay, how do I say this? The microphone makes me more distracted.
Okay.
No, it's
All
okay.
right.
No, it's okay.
Yeah, we have.
Yeah, sure.
Just
But
put it
I
right
think sometimes that racism right now, there's a white guilt going on, and I feel that it's not just the white people who are racist. African Americans are racist. Japanese are racist. Chinese are racist. I'm from Cuba. Cubans are racist. Not everybody is, but it's like there's an example. When I was going to the University of Minnesota, I lived in Cedar Square West for a while, and I was in an elevator going up the elevator to my apartment, and I was the only person in the elevator, and there was a African American grandfather with his granddaughter, and he told her, "Look at that guy. He's our oppressor. He's our enemy." Okay? Now, hey, wait a minute. I'm just trying to go to the university to get myself a degree to improve my life. Okay, I'm nobody's oppressor. I'm nobody's enemy. So we have to acknowledge that it's not just that racism is not a white thing. It's a human thing. And I think we have to get to that point to acknowledge that and get real about it and not point fingers and say, hey, we are all part of this equation. Everybody's responsible.
I can understand that perspective, but what it's missing is power. So, of course, white people can experience prejudice. Of course, white people can experience bias. The problem is the system in which we live in also colludes with that bias, right? So if I'm mean to you and I say, you're my oppressor and you're white, you can feel sad in that moment, but you're not going to lose a job because of that. You're not going to lose your prestige in this community because of that, right? So because this tie to power makes the difference, right? Of course, people can be biased. You could be called names, right? But your life expectancy is higher. The way in which teachers call on you and the way in which teachers think that you're smart is different, right? And so the outcomes are different for white people who hold privilege, and everyone holds privilege, right? I'm able-bodied. I hold privilege, right? Someone who is not able-bodied has different privileges that I have. And everyone has dominant identities and subordinate identities. Everyone has privilege. And that's not to negate the ways in which privilege works in people's lives. And when we say that white people are racist or colluding with racism, we're talking about a system of power. Look at our presidents. Go to any college or university and look at who's on the walls. Look at who wasn't allowed in these universities 30 years ago, 40 years ago, right? Look at all of the outcomes for people of color in this country. There was a study that they did where they tried to get people to get as far as they could in the job on that day, right? And they just disclosed felonies. And so they asked everyone to disclose a felony or not disclose a felony and see how far they got, right? So this is the system of power that I'm talking about. White men who disclosed a felony got more jobs than black men who didn't, right? And so while you can experience individual acts of meanness based on this color of your skin, it's not backed up by a system, which is the type of racism that I'm talking about.
Just one moment, please. Just one moment.
Thank you for being here, sir. I have not yet met you. I'm Elena Simone Tyler. I'm the Associate Pastor for Justice and Mission. I want to thank you, Amber, for being here. I want to thank you for the clarity in which you just responded to that question and everything that you said about the systemic, the power that goes along with race in our country. Our pastor just preached about that this morning. So what Amber is saying is consistent with what we have understood here at Westminster. And if you didn't get to come to the first service, then please come to the second one. Tim has just come from having traveled through the South, where there is yet great evidence of this. One of the things that Tim did was that he called the names of people who have been killed in police violence, including kitty corner to this building. And so what I don't want us to have our guest subjected to is disputation when she is trying to help us get some tools. So I would just ask that maybe we let Amber continue with her presentation and we save the questions for the end.
We only have just a few more minutes, and so let's.
I'll go
because
through
we
the
have
rest
to
of my
stop.
slides quickly, and hopefully we can have some time for questions. One of the things that I mentioned when we talk about talking to kids about race, people are like, what is the talk? Tell me what the talk is and how we do it. How do we start the talk? And my response is always, it's a series of talks, right? There's not one talk, there's not two talks, it's a series of talks. And right now, my kids are 6 and 8 years old, which means that I have to talk about dinosaurs. And I have to talk about, hey, Mom, I can move one toe and not the other one. Hey, Mom, do you have to pay more to learn how to drive with one hand than with two, right? So those regular everyday conversations and leaning into those conversations and have conversations with kids on a regular basis are the talks, right? Because one minute my kids are talking about, what were they talking about yesterday? If they could buy shoes, one pair of shoes that would like live with them their entire lives and they could just crank and make it bigger, right? And then the second, they were like, if two people identify as theys, are they theysters? Are they sisters? Are they brothers? And I'm like, I don't know. Sometimes they call each other nibblings or siblings. I don't know, right? And so the talk happens over and over again. The questions happen all the time, right? And the things that activate my shark music are the things that are my own identity. One time my son was like, why are all the black kids in the school the bad ones? And I was like, oh, baby, right? So we had to have a talk about sometimes not everybody's home is safe. And sometimes not everybody's home is a place where they can express themselves. And sometimes that's because of things that happened a long time ago that are still impacting us today. And they're 6 and 8, so they're like, okay, whatever, next question, right? Like it's not as deep to them as it is to me, but then I go and find more answers to that question. How would I have answered it different, right? Or sometimes my kids, especially in previous jobs, I had to work really closely with the police. And I have to explain to them how the relationship with the police is hard sometimes as a Black person. And they don't understand that. And so when they first asked me, why don't Black people like the police? I'm like, well, sometimes they're good and sometimes they're not. And that was okay when they were 5 and they asked again. And I was like, I have to think about this. And I was like, think of 4 Oreos, right? And 2 of those Oreos have toothpaste in them, but they look the same. And the other 2 are regular Oreos. If all of those Oreos are police, you don't know which one you're going to get. And so you might be a little scared of all of those Oreos. That's kind of what it's like, right? So I have to change my story or how I talk to kids depending on their age, depending on where developmentally appropriate is. And they're 6 and 8, right? They don't care as much about my answer, but I care. And so I have to continue to think. And sometimes when they ask questions about the talk, I have to be the one that says, I don't know, kiddo. I don't know. And this makes my body feel really uncomfortable. And let's look it up together. Maybe we can find an answer together. And that's better than trying to shut them up, right? Shut up because I said so, right? It's also never too young. So people start noticing, and babies start noticing and being secure in their gender and their sex around age 3 or 4. So when they're asking questions about their gender or sexuality, like they know I'm a girl, I'm a boy, what that means to them by the time they're like 3, 4, 5, developmentally. They did this thing called the doll test, where they asked kids who was the pretty doll, who was the smart doll, who was the bad doll. And this was years ago. And I do this with my kids, and the results are similar. This is the pretty doll. This is the smart doll. This is the fun doll. That's the bad doll. That's the angry doll. That's the ugly doll. We're talking children, 3 to 6 years old, right? So if they're old enough to understand good and bad based on race, they're old enough to have conversations about where that came from. And I also say that these are ongoing conversations, like they really don't stop. You will be talking about race and gender and class and all of these other things over and over again, and the names change and the terms change, and I always feel like I'm behind. And I do this every day of my life. I do this in my free time. It's personal and professional importance to me, and I'm always trying to find new ways to connect and learn. I would say the first thing that I would ask folks to do is think about your body. Think about what's happening in your body. So when you feel the need to respond to something that I'm saying, when you feel the need to be like, maybe not, when you feel the need to dismiss that, what's happening in your body? Your body will tell you more about your mood than anything else. You angry, you sad, your shoulders up here, your heart beating fast, you feel like it's coming out of your chest. Understand and feeling your feelings, I work with therapists, right? That's what we do all day. And when I say feel your feelings, this is the best thing that I have come up with. Because when you say feel your feelings, people are like, what else will I feel? Like, of course I feel my feelings. Like, what else would I feel? Feeling your feelings last literally 90 seconds. That's it. If you actually sit and feel your feelings, it lasts 90 seconds. So it's taking something's happening in your body. You feel sad, you feel angry, whatever it is. Most people think their feelings. They're like, I feel sad because my husband said he was going to take out the trash, and he didn't take out the trash, and now the trash stinks, and now I'm angry. Or my wife was going to do this, and now she's not here, and I'm so upset, and I was going to do this thing, right? Or my kid came home, and they didn't do the thing I asked them for. I'm upset, right? You're thinking your feelings. Feeling your feelings means sitting, identifying, breathing. I feel it tight in my chest. Why does my chest feel so tight? Just let my chest feel tight. Is it getting better? It's probably a 5 on a scale of 10 in terms of its tightness. Now it's a 2, now it's a 3, now it's gone, right? Feeling your feelings is the best way to process your emotions and being in a place where you can move on from them, where you can actually get to your frontal lobe and you're not responding from your limbic system. And that's it.
Well, Amber, you have brought so much to today. We really appreciate your being here. And as you can tell, I think we could have her for a lot longer. But we have to bring this program to a close. Next week, we will welcome Melissa Williams from the Harmon Center Family Place Program Director, and Nick Lynch, also from the Harmon Center, who is a speech language pathologist. They will discuss trauma and its impact and the multidisciplinary approach that is being used right here at the Harmon Center to help our children. Again, Amber Buck, you have brought so much to us this morning, and we really appreciate it. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending.